Hi everybody, welcome back to English for You. I'm Pat.
I'm Mike.
And yesterday we started talking about the Russian invasion of Ukraine in this year, not to talk about all the news and what's happening and the lives of people who are being destroyed by this terrible crisis, but to talk about Ukraine's president and Volodymyr Zelensky and what he's been doing to motivate his people.
That's right. Of course, he's been leading the country and making many important decisions to keep his country fighting against the Russian army that invaded, but he's also been giving a lot of important speeches. I think almost every night he goes on television to speak to the people of Ukraine about what happened in the war, but he's also made some really important speeches to governments around the world, trying to get their support, get their help in fighting the Russians. And to do this, he's been making some really smart decisions. He gave, for example, a speech to the UK government, the Parliament in London, and in that speech, he didn't just say, hey, help us out, we need help to fight the Russians. No, he quoted Shakespeare and he took some ideas from Winston Churchill, the great British leader from World War II. He kind of used some of their ideas from their speeches in order to get a more of an emotional reaction from people. Very smart.
Very smart. Now today we're going to look at some other wartime leaders, including Churchill, and the power of their speeches. We'll see their examples, we see what they tried to do and what they achieved. Let's check out day 2.
Reading.
Churchill, Roosevelt, Zelensky. Wartime's best speakers. People have drawn comparisons between Volodymyr Zelensky's speeches and those of other great wartime leaders. During World War II, Winston Churchill led Britain, and Franklin D Roosevelt led the U.S. Both delivered speeches that have become some of the most famous in history. In June 1940, Britain failed to defeat the Nazis in France. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave perhaps his most famous speech shortly after. He said, "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke emotionally after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. The speech started with, "Yesterday, December 7, 1941, a day which will live in infamy, the United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan." The speech was enough to stir the American people into willingly joining the war.
All right, so let's get into our article for today. Now, yesterday we learned a little bit about Volodymyr Zelensky and his speeches just in the last few months as his country has been fighting Russia. But we can go back in time to get some other good examples of wartime speeches. It says people have drawn comparisons between Volodymyr Zelensky's speeches and those of other great wartime leaders. Okay, yeah, well, when there's things that are kind of similar in many ways, we might make comparisons between those things. It's a common thing to do, a natural thing to do, and sometimes an interesting thing to do. So you have two things that are similar in lots of different ways, but maybe not exactly the same. And you kind of look at them next to each other, talk about the things that are different, the things that are better or worse. When you're buying things, especially something quite expensive, you'll probably go out and make a comparison between this bicycle and that one. What's the price? What's the quality? What do I need it to do? And then you can make decisions and you can discover and learn things by making those comparisons. When we do this, we're comparing, C-O-M-P-A-R-E, that would be the verb form. For example, there is no comparison between listening to music on your phone and seeing a band perform live. It's a much more powerful experience, of course, seeing live music performed than listening on your little phone.
Okay, we'll look at some comparisons in a moment, but first, let's check out today's language in focus. So today's language in focus is something we use when we are making certain types of comparisons. It's the use of that of or those of and then plus another noun. Here we're using that of or those of because we don't want to mention the thing we're comparing twice. That is one thing, of course, and those is many things. So depending on whether we're comparing singular or plural, we use that for singular and those for plural. Here's an example. The color of this car is the same as the color of my car. We're repeating words. That takes a bit too long. So we can say the color of this car is the same as that of my car, with that meaning the color of my car. The books in this part of the library are similar to the books on my parents' bookshelf. We don't need to repeat the books. That's just pointless. We say the books in this part of the library are similar to those of my parents' bookshelf. So the ones my parents have. We're making a comparison, but to save us from repeating the noun again, we're using that of and those of. So here people are making comparisons between Zelensky's speeches and those of, or the speeches of, the speeches given by other wartime leaders.
That's right. And of course, wartime, this noun, talks about when things happen during a time of war. All right, so wartime work might be different from peacetime work. That's a word we could also use. When there's no war, we could call that being peacetime as a noun, or peacetime life is much easier than wartime life. We can use this to talk about all sorts of things that might happen or be different, or we might only see in a country when it is at war or during wartime. For example, it's not just the soldiers who will be asked to sacrifice during wartime.
Yeah, or during wartime conditions.
During wartime
like
conditions,
that.
sure. Wartime sacrifices are asked of all, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at some of these leaders, including the one that Zelensky kind of borrowed from.
Right, yeah.
We see during World War II, Winston Churchill led Britain and Franklin D Roosevelt led the US.
Mm-hmm.
They were the president and prime minister for some or all of these wars.
That's right, and both were respected as being good leaders, but also as being good speakers. It says both delivered speeches that have become some of the most famous in history. Absolutely. Two men living at the same time, fighting on the same side, but they could both give a speech. That's for sure.
So let's start with Churchill. We see in June 1940, Britain failed to defeat the Nazis in France.
Okay.
They were driven back. They couldn't fight over there. They were defeated. If you defeat somebody, you beat them in a war, a game, some kind of competition. Here we use the passive voice. Britain was defeated. If we flip it around, the Nazis, Nazi Germany, defeated the British Army.
That's right. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave perhaps his most famous speech shortly after. Yeah, this is a dark time for Britain during the war. America wasn't fighting yet. Britain was standing alone. France had been defeated. So it was time for a really good speech because people needed encouragement. So shortly after, this is a phrase that just means a little time after something that happened before. It's a great phrase to use when you're telling a story or giving an idea to people of what happened when, a timeline or something like that. So I got home at 4 o'clock and shortly after I went out again to go to the store. So it wasn't hours later, it might have been a few minutes later, but not much time because it was shortly after. So bad news from fighting in France. The British soldiers had run back to England, and now it was time for a big speech. So what did Winston Churchill say to inspire his people?
Well, he was talking about what would happen when or if the Nazis came across to invade Britain.
Right.
And in the article we see, he said, "We shall fight them on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." So you can see how that language is very, very similar to the language Zelensky used. You know, differences because Ukraine is a different country and has different features, but very similar language with these different places where the fighting will take place. The fact that we're not going to give up or surrender. That's what surrender means, to give up, to stop fighting, to say, that's it, you've won, I can't fight anymore. That's it. It's over.
I'm waving my white flag.
Yes.
I surrender. All right. So there you go. Yeah, you can really tell if you go back to yesterday's article, read Zelensky's speech from a few months ago, and see the comparison to Churchill's speech from 80 years ago or so. Next, we read Franklin D. Roosevelt, of course, the other great World War II leader, the American president. Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke emotionally after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, of course, which would be December 1941. But another time, America had just been attacked. The country was at war. People were very scared, didn't know what was going to happen. They needed a good speech. And of course, this was a big shock to people. 2,000 sailors and other people were killed in the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the nation was feeling a lot of emotions. So Roosevelt spoke emotionally with a lot of emotion. Anger, sadness, determination, all of those things.
And this happened after the Empire of Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. Here, bomb is being used as a verb. A bomb as a noun is just a big explosive device that causes lots of damage and destruction. So to bomb as a verb means to drop bombs on. Back in those days, it would have usually been to drop out of planes. We can use it more these days to bomb somewhere. Could be to go and put the bomb there, leave it there, and it'll explode later. But back then, it usually meant planes would fly over, drop the bombs, and they would go bang. For example, did you know US warplanes bombed Formosa several times near the end of World War II?
That's true, and the Japanese were here. I think they bombed Wanhua in the president's office. Oh my gosh, how exciting. Anyways, Pearl Harbor, this is of course something you might know from history movies or history class or war movies. This is the American Navy base in Hawaii. I believe it's near Honolulu, but don't quote me because I've never been to Hawaii. But yes, Pearl Harbor is also famously the place where Japan attacked America on December 7th, 1941, which caused America to join World War II, I should say, which caused America to join World War II. So when you see Pearl Harbor, you think of that attack. So what was the speech that he made like a day or two after the attack?
Well, it was in fact the day after.
The day after?
We see in the article, the speech started with yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. So he starts off really by stating the news, but the key word he puts in pretty early is the word infamy. Let's check that out. So Roosevelt used the word infamy. Infamy is the state of being well known, being very famous. You can see the relationship between fame, famous, and infamy here, but for something bad, for something horrible. He's saying this was a terrible, terrible event and people will remember it for a long time because of how bad it was. And by putting this in his speech nice and early, he kind of gets everybody feeling like, yes, this is terrible. We'll never forget this terrible thing that happened. And that gets people thinking in the right way for how he wants them to respond to his speech. And what he said was that Japan had attacked suddenly.
That's right, suddenly and deliberately attacked. Suddenly means very, very quickly, at once, with no warning, with no time passing, no idea that this will happen soon. No, it just happens now. And of course, the other idea is that when things happen suddenly, we don't really have time to get ready or to prepare for them. So that can be surprising or shocking or something like that when things happen suddenly. This was important, of course, because he wanted people to know that Japan had not warned America. They hadn't said, we're angry with you, we want to have a war, the war will start tomorrow. No, they just attacked and there was no warning. And I guess for Americans at that time, this was seen as being, ooh, that's really really tricky that they would do that and not even tell us that they were starting a war. So that's why he included it in the speech. Here's our example sentence for suddenly. A dog suddenly ran out into the road, so all the cars screeched to a stop. It was a big surprise. You couldn't see the dog, and suddenly there it was in the road. No time to prepare. I hope the dog was okay.
Well, the other adverb that Roosevelt used in the speech was deliberately. He said Japan had attacked on purpose. Now, you might think, well, of course Japan meant to attack. Of course it wasn't an accident that all these bombs were dropped on Pearl Harbor. But again, there's a reason he puts this in the speech. And again, it's to make people angry, like, Japan did this on purpose. They attacked in a surprise attack on purpose.
It wasn't an accident or something.
This wasn't a fair fight with two nations saying, we will fight each other. This came out of nowhere, and it was done that way on purpose to try and get an advantage in the war. And that's not right, and that's not fair, and that'll get you, my listeners, angry.
That's right, and it sure did get people angry. And we also had that word naval. He was said that they were attacked by the naval forces of Japan. Naval relates to the Navy. When we think about the soldiers, the army, the military, we think of the army being on land, the Air Force in their planes being up in the sky. The Navy will be in the boats on the water, submarines under the water, even airplanes that land on boats. Those would be naval forces like they used at Pearl Harbor. But basically, when you see naval, you're thinking of ships, warships. We're not talking about the ships that carry things around or fishing boats. No, naval is warships out on the water.
Right, and related to that word is the word force. He said the Pearl Harbor was attacked by naval and air forces. Force here means a group of people doing military work, but it could also be used for police work. We talk about a country's or a city's police force. And we talk about the armed forces, that's the army. The air force, as Mike mentioned, that's the soldiers in the air flying planes. Here's another example. The Central American country of Costa Rica has no military forces. They have no army at all. Kind of like Iceland that we looked at a couple of months back. They don't have a military force.
Right, they have police and all that, but they don't have tanks, they don't have soldiers and that kind of thing. And the Empire of Japan, when we use this, we're talking about a specific time of Japanese history. This is between the periods of 1868 and 1947, maybe even 1945 at the end of the war. But this is when the emperor was like the king of Japan. He had all the power, and it's also the period when Japan was starting to expand and build an empire by invading China and Taiwan and Korea, places like that. Well, Manchuria, that's China, Russia. So this is that time period, which of course ended with the end of World War II and the dropping of the atomic bombs.
So that was Roosevelt's speech, and we see in the article the speech was enough to stir the American people into willingly joining the war. So before then, a lot of the Americans would say, that's a war in Europe. We do not want to get involved, okay? Japan is over there and they're kind of allied with Germany, but we don't really want to fight them either right now. They haven't attacked us. We're maybe not happy with what they're doing. So there wasn't a lot of war support. But after this, everyone was stirred up. And if you stir people up, or like we have the phrasal verb here, stir people into doing something, you motivate them by making them angry, emotional, excited. You kind of get them, right, that's it. I've had enough. I'm going to do something about this. We can't just let this stand. We have to act. That's what stirring somebody up or stirring somebody into doing something means. And in this case, it's getting them to do it willingly.
That's right. You want people to go to war willingly, I guess, as a leader, because that means you don't have to force them to join the army. They're like, no, I want to fight for my country. I want to go out and do this thing and maybe even risk my own life. I'm doing it willingly. I'm doing it because I want to do it, basically. Maybe not with a smile on my face, but because I know it's important and you don't have to tell me to do it. I am going to do it. For example, once I gave my dog a treat, she willingly got into the bathtub so I could wash her. Otherwise, I'd have to carry her and she'd be like, no, I don't want to wash her. Give her a treat. She's like, oh, okay.
Okay.
I'll go willingly. I'm happy to have a bath.
Wonder if that'll work with children.
Possibly.
May have to try it. Okay, so those are two examples of very famous, very powerful, very effective speeches by wartime leaders. And of course, one of them at least relates back to Zelensky's speech in front of the UK Parliament. Now that's all the time we've got today, except for our chat question. So let's go to that right now.
For You Chat.
All right, so we spent a couple of days looking at some famous speeches. First, Zelensky's speech most recently, and then, of course, two of the great World War II speeches from Churchill and Roosevelt. So on that topic of famous speeches, Pat, I'm sure you have a good answer for this. What's the most famous speech you know?
Well, there are so many speeches we could think about. We could think of lines delivered during plays. We could think political speeches and things like that. I'm going to do one that's a sort of a combination of both. It's an old one. So this is around 50-something BC. Okay. Julius Caesar has just been killed. Okay. He's been killed. The leader of Rome has been killed. And the entire city is wondering, well, what happens next? Do we go with the side that killed him, or do we go with Caesar's side? No one's quite sure. And one of Caesar's kind of people, one of his friends, Mark Antony, makes a speech at Caesar's funeral. And he seems to be saying, everything's good, everything's calm here. I've come to bury Caesar and let's move on. But the way he said it absolutely set the entire city of Rome on fire. It stirred them into action, and suddenly everyone was really angry at the people who killed Caesar, and they had to very quickly run away. So in that one speech, without seeming to blame them or attack them, because he was standing there next to them, Mark Antony managed to get everyone on his side against the people who killed Caesar. And in the play Julius Caesar by Shakespeare, you can get a version of this speech which kind of uses some of the historical sources but adds Shakespeare kind of dialing it up as well.
Interesting.
So for an example of a real speech that was also a play speech, that's a good one.
Okay, have a look at that if you want to. Learn some interesting history, get some Shakespeare at the same time, and you'll also be treating yourself to one of the great speeches of history. Thanks for joining us, guys. Take care of yourselves out there, and we'll see you back here sometime soon for more great articles.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Vocabulary Review.
Comparison. Many people are drawing comparisons between Madonna's and Lady Gaga's songs. They found some similarities between their songs. Wartime. The country could not get enough food and supplies to support everyone during wartime. Bomb. Many British children were sent to other areas while the Germans were bombing London in the 1940s. Suddenly. The sky was clear and blue, and then it suddenly began raining heavily outside. Force. Homer was a pilot in the Air Force for 10 years before he joined NASA. Willingly. I participated in gym class at school, but I wouldn't willingly play sports on my own.
智慧小补帖
Defeat. Surrender. Infamy. Deliberately.
以上节目是由活用空中美语制作，活用空中美语杂志，请洽询全国各大书店。如欲索取试听教材，请来电02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上网查询，网址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net